Even though not yet convicted in Imperial China, being a prisoner was barbaric, unlike in the modern world. Torture, forced labor, or execution were all options for the convicts. Beheading was the most common method of punishment, and sometimes chariots were run over the prisoner to rip their corpse apart or even cook in a cauldron. Unless proven innocent, prisoners were deemed guilty. In this video, we will take you through the pages of history to know how gruesome it was to be a prisoner in Imperial China. So let's dive directly into the situation of a prisoner in Imperial China to uncover the slightest offenses and punishments to the draconian crimes and sentences of the era. The Five Punishments. The Five Punishments was the collective term for bodily penalties imposed by pre-modern dynasty China's judicial system. The nature of the Five Punishments changed over time. They included tattooing, chopping off the nose, amputation of one or both feet, castration, and death before the reign of the Western Han Dynasty Emperor Han. These were altered to penal servitude, banishment, execution, or physical punishment in the form of lashing with bamboo strips or flogging with a stick after the Sui and Tang dynasties. The Wu Xing of Five Punishments was adopted as a punishment system for offenders in China. The prisoner's crime determined which of the five punishments he would receive. Tattooing and amputation were discontinued as penalties during the Western Han Dynasty, and the five punishments were modified further in later dynasties. The five sentences had reached their fundamental shape by the Sui Dynasty, which they would retain until the end of the Imperial era. During the Sui Dynasty, 581 to 618 CE, the five punishments had expanded to include mild and heavy stick beatings, civil labor, deportation, and death by strangling or execution. There were many degrees of punishment within each penalty. A prisoner sentenced to be beaten with a light stick would be given one of 5 degrees of punishment. It depended on the severity of the crime, from 10 to 50 strokes. Even exile had degrees. Criminals with more serious crimes had to travel the farthest. This may sound unusual given that strangling, in which the executioner wrapped a rope around the victim's neck, was a violent and lengthy procedure. Beheading was seen to be worse than strangling in terms of execution. Unlike strangulation, beheading required simply a good sword sweep. But beheading was regarded as a more humiliating way to die in Chinese culture. Whereas under the Tang Dynasty, the first two methods included whipping the offender with a 3.5-foot-long thin rod. The thighs and buttocks of criminals were thrashed. The next category was punitive punishment, which might last anywhere from 1 to 3 years. Exile was the fourth penalty. Criminals were exiled 1,000 miles away and were compelled to slavery. Such punishments were for marrying non-Chinese or robbery. The most severe penalty was execution. Under the Tang Dynasty, 144 offenses were punished by strangulation and 89 crimes by decapitation of multiple kinds. The offenses of the 10 abominations were classified into 4 categories. The first category included offenses against the emperor, such as threatening to revolt. Doctor malpractice fell into this category, especially if the doctor failed to treat the emperor. The next category included treasonous crimes, which included switching allegiances, murder of government officials, or betrayal of the government. According to historians, the Tang killed 200 officials who swapped sides and planned to fight against the emperor. Crimes against the family fell under the third category. Murdering a family member, selling them into slavery, or neglecting to give sufficient assistance to an aging family member all fall within this category. The heads of the home had the last say. It was common for a father to beat his kid, but the kid might face the death penalty if he hit his father. Laws against sorcery and poisoning were included in the last category of abominations. There were also consequences for numerous killings. Ling Chi, death by 1,000 cuts. The Ling Chi, often known as slicing death or death by 1,000 cuts, dates back to the 10th century. For any prisoner, lynching was considered the harshest punishment conceivable. Only those who committed the country's worst offenses, known as the 10 Abominations, were punished in this way. These crimes included treason, excision, child murder, murder of a husband, revolt, and magic were among them. The Ling Chi was generally composed of 8 body slices, though it could be more. Cuts were made to the face first, and then on the hands, feet, chest, and stomach. Lastly, the final cut was either decapitation or a heart cut. The reason for such brutal punishment was to destroy the afterlife of the offender. Torture for confession. The entire investigation and legal process in Chinese law were rigorous. Witnesses and defendants would bow down in front of an official throughout the trial, and the accused were questioned. If the convicts began to avoid inquiries, the official promptly ordered torture. Initially, the torture was quite basic and straightforward. A prisoner's arms or a reluctant witness were wrapped around a pole. They were then repeatedly beaten as long as they maintained their innocence. Whereas in criminal trials, questioning geared primarily at gaining the defendant's confession became the primary form of court proof. In short, it was common to use torture to extract confessions. Torture was believed to be a significant component of the investigation process for the investigators. Torture was acceptable for the government to extract a confession. A captured criminal might willingly confess to the offense before the torture starts. If it was the case, the legal code required that the sentence be decreased. You were not to be penalized if you confessed to a crime before the torture started. Yet, you would be accountable for any losses. Furthermore, if you confessed to a crime and were later found to be guilty of a lesser one, you were not held liable for the minor crime because you were being punished for the bigger ones. Criminals even used to send someone to the authorities to confess on their behalf. There were several exceptions in situations of murder, bodily injury, or property damage that could not be repaired. As most prisoners refused to confess, courts were forced to impose torture. Social humility by crime marks. The objective of criminal law was to impose Confucian principles and morality to establish a well-ordered society, and laws were thought to be an important component of civilization's moral structure. Those who disobeyed them deserved to be severely punished. According to Confucianism, leaders should take moral action, and harsh enforcement should be used only as a last resort. On the contrary, punitive enforcement was common in Imperial China, using physical or lethal punishment. Only specific types of convicts were transported to prison homes. The majority of the time, inmates were punished physically for their misdeeds. This meant that, depending on the seriousness of the offense, convicts were subject to execution or torture. The morality of these penalties were just brutal and unexpected. These penalties included caning in front of a court or public whippings. Tower cages and contraptions that secured the neck or strapped a large stone to the neck were forms of such social humiliation. Punishments to both the oppressed and the offender. Chinese law emphasizes on core values of respect. There were rules on how a person should treat their rulers, parents, spouses, siblings, and friends, the 5 key relationships of a person. This system had different punishments for different convicts. Prisoners would be punished based on their relationship with the oppressed. A prisoner in Imperial China who committed a crime against an elderly person would face harsher punishment than the same felon against a younger person. In addition to that, if a kid accused their parent of a crime, the youngster was punished alongside their parent. This was to emphasize the importance of violating filial piety. There were exceptions if it was for treason or rebellion against the ruler. Today's prisons would be considered a 5-star facility compared to the condition of prisoners in ancient China. Thanks for watching the video. If you liked the video, check out other historical videos on our channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so that you don't miss out on such interesting topics.